Welcome to the All-Inclusive Podcast, a podcast that delves into the world of inclusion, from accessibility all the way through to diversity. Today's podcast, we share insights and experiences from all around the world of inclusion. Today we're joined by two special guests to raise awareness of Mental Health Week. Mark, Founding Director of Corpwell UK and Smart Recruitment Online, and Maylis, Programme Director of Create Space.
Thanks, Ross. I'm Mark Stevens. I'm the CEO and founder of two companies, Smart Recruit Online. So we aid businesses with talent attraction, and also a project which we've launched recently called Corpwell, which is a directory of businesses that support wellness and mental health, bringing together people who are responsible for corporate wellness and mental health, funnily enough, within the business, with the experts and suppliers within the industry.
So my name's Maylis. I've basically worked for the last 10 years at the intersection of creative industries, mental health, and just supporting businesses, future leaders to promote well-being in the workplace as a competitive advantage. And I'm also the program director at We Create Space, and we're a self-empowerment platform and offer resources, events, and services to empower individuals themselves to support and continue their self-care practices.
Awesome. That sounds absolutely awesome. So we'll start off with the first one. What do we mean by mental health?
So mental health is quite an interesting one, isn't it? Because I think all the stigmas of the past of what people would have said if you'd have asked them that question 5 years ago, very different to the way that we interpret mental health today. So I think that the modern way of thinking about mental health, certainly from a corporate perspective, is supporting the mental health of the people that work for us in order to optimize their performance within the business. That means keeping them well, keeping them healthy, and supporting them in every way we can, so that we provide a caring environment in which people can excel.
It always reminds me when we're talking about mental health to when I was president of the student union. We're going back 15 years ago. I'm feeling old here. But mental health, particularly in the student sector, can get quite low. It's one of the highest sectors of depression and the likes of that. And when we used to do education 15 years ago, it was always around the terminology. Like, the question is, what is mental health? Well, everybody's got mental health. But as soon as you mention mental health, people think mental illness. And it's making people realize that everybody, for me, has mental health, and it varies during the day. It varies how much sleep you got, to who you've interacted with, to what you've eaten, to the deals, the stresses you've had to go through. And if you're always wary that you have mental health, and you've always got mental health, and if you take care of your mental health, that is a good preventative step from it slipping down to the point where it could be causing problems. So mental health, to me, I'm going to link it to just physical health. We've all got physical health. We sometimes only think about our physical health until we get a problem and have to go to the doctors. But and it's exactly the same with mental health.
No, I completely agree with what you're saying, because I was gonna how I understand mental health is just like an awareness, or even just the natural state of a well-being, or mental well-being. And as you said, everybody has mental health, and that focus on mental ill health has been so pressing, and that's what, as you said, really empowered or really pushed through with that stigma. And for me, I think when we talk about mental health in the workplace in particular, there tends to be that fine line between where does the responsibility lie. And I think it's about individuals themselves gaining awareness about their mental state, what their feelings are, what the thoughts they're having about themselves are, what their emotional state is. And I think one of the things that is quite underrated actually is how people are not able to always identify emotions. We either saying I'm happy, sad, I'm mad, or angry. But there's so many emotions, there's so many feelings as just part of the spectrum in between that. And because we don't have the emotional, like I would say, even awareness to go there and process or even understand what we're feeling, not only in our minds, but in our body, we tend to stay on those ones. And so I feel like, just that general awareness of our well-being mentally, which impacts the physical and impacts the emotional and everything else as well.
I've thought about that a lot in the past, is that, and it's similar to physical health. If we had the lexicon to describe the more complex emotions that we had, would we not start thinking about our mental health until we feel like we've got a problem? Like, what's the matter? You're sad. well, actually, there might have been 17 levels of your mental state until you kind of finally identified that you're in the zone. Because I've often thought about that, because I've often thought about with physical health. It's the same. You often don't think about where you are in your physical health until you've pulled something or yeah. I bet there's a culture somewhere in the world that's kind of like probably an ancient Indian tribe or something like that, that's more empathetic, that's got a lot of different words for different levels of emotion.
I think it's an interesting discussion all on its own. It's sort of what constitutes mental health. And I think you've alluded to a very important point, Ross, especially from an employer perspective. How do we look after the mental health of our staff? Well,
yeah.
If we help them and encourage them to maintain a good level of physical fitness, to maintain a positive diet, to do the things that enable them to get a good night's sleep, to look after themselves when they've got medical issues, and to seek help and advice and support when they've got external issues that don't really seem to have anything to do with mental health, things like financial difficulties or legal issues that they might be facing outside of work. So for me, it's quite a complex jigsaw, not really a complex jigsaw, but there are components around it that are all intrinsically linked to the way that we feel about ourselves and the way we describe the way that we feel.
Yeah, and I think within the workplace, and we'll kind of like nicely slid into the next question. Mm-hmm. So well done us. For me, it's always about like, how do you run your company? I'm not going to tell anybody how to run their company. I just kind of know how I want to run mine. And one, it's treating people like individuals. Doesn't matter what background they're from, whether like what ethnic minority, whether they're a man or a woman. It's just all about the person. Even if they're dyslexic, you don't treat them as a dyslexic. You treat them as a person just because they're in this group. But that also kind of reflects in mental health as well. Is it's the person before the job role. It's the person before the group. And it's not a case of you need to do this job because this is your job role. It's how are you first? How's your day? How's everything else? And then the job role kind of comes second. So for me, it's always the person comes first, person-centric organization. And when that person is feeling right about themselves and good and in a good mental state, they will naturally perform that job to the better ability. So it's all kind of switching, it's, you're not occupying a job role, you're a human being, just happens to do a job within an organization.
I think that people-centric organizations look at team as being the most important part of a successful business. And each individual forms a component of that team. If one part of the team is failing in any way, then the business fails. And that's probably how mental health works as well. Just one part of your life can be falling apart and or that you're struggling with, and then everything else can break down around it. And maybe just thinking about it in that way, we would take a different sort of approach to the way we look after ourselves as well, as a way that the business can potentially support us.
Yeah, and just on what you said, the human being part, we tend to make that distinction between the human being versus the human doing. And, there's so much emphasis on the achievement and the productivity. And essentially, when you go to work, we somehow have believed this fallacy that you can separate the work self and the home self and just literally walk through the door and be, push everything away and compartmentalize. But your nervous system doesn't know the difference, whether you're at work or at home. And specifically now that, well-being at work is well-being at home, everything comes into play. So we really want to actually get conversations starting to unpack that, because I think it's not just that simple of saying, oh, we're going to, support you in one way, but we need to look at the whole. And this is just generally, if you look at, the kind of holistic practices where they tend to look at not only the mind, but incorporate mind and body, like this is what we're also trying to do, because we're not just living up here. When we're looking at physical pain or, physical health is about pain and locating it, but mental health also, it moves through the body. So how are we really having those discussions? And in terms of, people and companies specifically, it makes it quite difficult because from the leadership standpoint, you have to have that level of awareness already in order to inform, strategies that better support people. But when there's rigidity, it gets tough. Yeah.
It's very interesting. And like, I'm a bit of a fitness geek. My background's athletics. So I've always been interested in the link between mental health and physical health, and there is actually stuff that you can do that I think in the future companies will probably integrate. And not a lot of people know this, but when the level of cortisol in the body, which is just a natural stress hormone, it's the thing that wakes us up in the morning, even though it's got a bad rep. But if it's been going for long enough in the body at too high of a level, it blunts the conversion of an amino acid called tryptophan into serotonin. Serotonin we probably all have heard of. It's the happy chemical in the brain. And it will, obviously the lack of that over a long enough period will tend to make you feel down and sad because you're not getting the chemical in. So there's a lot of things that can kind of be done, I think, within the workplace, but particularly with technology to kind of almost implement policies that may help fitness regimes, you know what I mean? Like stress tracking is on watches these days with heart rate variability. I don't want to go too technical into this, but there's potentially programs that can develop in the future that can help people with their physical wellness, which could be, you know, a bit of a high heart rate because of stress, and allow them to kind of take note that, you know, maybe they should have a lie-in. You know, maybe they should take a half day. That is maybe then suggested by the workplace. You know, and said, look, you're feeling stressed. Look, check your own heart rate data. I know I'm glad this is called. I'm probably going slightly off piece here because this is another business idea that I've got.
I think just coming back to the point that we're talking about right now in terms of, you know, the importance of mental health in the workplace. Not just from an individual perspective, but just from an employer perspective. And this is pretty much where I start my conversations with businesses when we're consulting with them on their strategy for recruitment and retention. You know, just look at the commercials. I mean, there's so much data coming out now. I was just refreshing my memory from the Deloitte report that came out last year. It was pretty detailed. And post-COVID, I think the stats are 1 in 3 people suffering from some form of mental health, and a really disproportionate number of those amongst younger people as well. So you look at the impact of this on the business in terms of attendance, and absenteeism and presenteeism. And, you know, I think the figure that was bandied around pre-COVID was £45 billion a year in the UK alone being lost through absenteeism. And that doesn't even include, you know, the build up to people taking time off through lack of presenteeism, you know, by working inefficiently. And I believe the statistic is for every £1 that you invest into people's wellness and mental health, there is a £5 return. And I think this is probably the best starting point in talking to a business at a sort of senior business level, and then working down towards the humanitarian and ethical aspects within mental health, and then starting to work out how we address each of these components.
And sometimes it's the simplest things. You know, you can often be drawn into like these programs that you're talking about could be very complicated. And how do you support somebody and how do you invest? And we done something that was quite simple and it had a dramatic effect, is that we noticed staff were getting backaches. You know, they're sitting all day. So I do yoga. So we end up getting one of the yoga teachers who now has a yoga business. He's doing very well. And he, every 2 weeks he comes in, and originally it was just to kind of massage people to kind of make sure that we weren't getting any repetitive strain injuries with sitting all the time. But we were surprised to see that Chris obviously ended up, called Chris the guy, he befriends everybody. He's a nice guy. People would kind of just go in there for a chat and a massage. But the effect on mental health was actually quite dramatic, because it was, you know, every 2 weeks on a Friday, you could get a massage. Sometimes on a Tuesday. So it varied. You could get a massage and you could just take time out while you were at work, just to pause, you know?
Yeah.
Disciplining ourselves to do positive things that break up the day. And I think this has been one of the biggest negatives of the COVID impact of people working from home, is that the level of intensity that now exists in just communicating with people through video calls like this. I mean, I reached burnout last year, managed to avoid a full breakdown on the back of it, but sort of, you know, had all the symptoms of just completely mental breakdown, physical ailments, all sorts of stuff going on that was just crazy. And I worked out, I was doing over 7 hours of video calls every day. And then when you start looking into the science behind this, you know, our bodies just aren't designed to be sitting there staring at the same distance as you've got from your screen for such long periods of time. when we talk to people in the office in the normal environment and we're breaking up a day, we're looking at different distances. So, the headache element, the fatigue that brings in. So, I mean, just having something positive to look forward to and to get away from your desk and to do something physically positive as well. And these are just simple things that businesses can do as well. They don't have to be costly.
It's going to get quite interesting because we're moving into this transition of businesses deciding whether people should stay at home, having a hybrid model, or just completely going back to work. And one of the things I noticed in my work is that as human beings, we're kind of terrible at processing transitions. We tend to kind of either be focused in the past or looking ahead to the future, but whatever happens in the present moment, we're kind of bulldozing through in order to get to the next thing. And what we're talking about here and facilitating spaces where either the businesses themselves understand through business cases what the value is of really embedding those practices and services for their staff members, but also on the individuals to take responsibility for what's coming up for them. What we're essentially doing from the individual perspective is promoting ways for them to self-regulate. And this is something for me, Mark, you shared about your burnout. It took me 6 years in therapy to understand that, because I, like yourself, experienced burnout at a really young age. And that's another thing that people don't often talk about, because children sometimes can actually experience burnout depending on the environment they're in. So for me, that was very much a cyclical thing. And I always found myself in the same situations. And when I entered the workspace and I was of a legal age, so to speak, I used drugs as a coping mechanism to get by. But when eventually I was ready to ask for help and I entered the healthcare space, I started to learn this new language. And as you said, what the body can take, what it can't take. And essentially my therapist said to me, yeah, you may have your addiction issues, but your problem is that you have an inability to self-regulate and regulate your emotions. And all that is just having a level of understanding so that you're better able to respond to situations rather than react. Because when we're in the middle of it and we're triggered, the next best thing for me in my case was self-soothing. What can I do to make myself feel better? Is it alcohol? Is it drugs? Is it just work? Is it anything else that can get me out of my own head? And right now, when we're seeing that people maybe didn't have that oversight or the community at work that could support them into checking in, I'm kind of interesting to see what's going to happen on the back of that. And, not to be kind of gloomy, but is there going to be another mental health pandemic on the back of what we just experienced? Because there's a lot of changes that happen for individuals. And I think noting the changes that happened in the transition, who we were then, who we are now, and what happened in the middle and how people are feeling is going to be super important to consider.
I was talking about the ticking time bomb 18 months ago. So God knows what's going to happen, when we come out of this period, just looking at some of the data already. I mean, suicide rates are double what they were pre-pandemic. And I think some of the longer term issues are just still to be realised. But I think what's coming out of this conversation for me is quite obvious, is that businesses have to look at prevention and helping individuals to understand what the elements are that can contribute towards prevention. And we talked about some of these things: physical fitness, diet, sleep, and all the rest of it, but also having that infrastructure in place to support them. And then I always revert it back to the commercial advantages of putting this in place. Again, you can improve productivity. The business then gets what it wants out of the arrangement between employer and employee, and keeping that business functioning. Providing a supporting infrastructure also influences the culture of the organisation and its subsequent brand. From a talent attraction perspective, and this is the synergy between my two roles in talent attraction and also through the Corpwell project. Certainly younger people, the younger generations now are prioritising culture and a caring culture as the leading thing that they're looking for in an employer. So, the business is almost the new family. We spend more time in the business than we do with our families, and finding a business that supports me in all those ways, in a genuine way, so that I can be at my best, as sort of emerged as a high priority for the talent out there. And businesses remember that they want to recruit the best people and retain the best people. It's now not an optional thing to put this sort of stuff into place.
I completely agree, and reflecting on our company, where we have a tendency to have a very high retention rate, and it's for that reason. And I started off with it just being the right thing to do. That's what I felt, And then it's like, actually, it is positively affecting people's mental health. And when we go out and have drinks, they get drunk and say thank you and tell us about some horror story of a previous employer and how they got stressed and this happened and how it's so much better now that they work for us. And it's sometimes that switch, and it's sad to say this, but it's sometimes that switch when people start seeing the financial benefit of doing something, that's when we might see the floodgates open to people taking care of mental health within the workplace in a way that I think is right for society. And we saw similar kind of switches in accessibility. You know, it is the right thing to do, and it's the morally right thing to do to have accessibility and take it serious with regards to diversity. But when reports started coming out on the financial impact organizations that weren't taking it seriously, it triggered a lot more switch and a lot more seriousness to look at it. So
that's partly because it's a top-down thing. You know, if people at the top of the organization don't drive it downwards, then it tends to just be something we talk about and just never gets actioned.
Yeah,
it always down it, then it gets funded, and people feel an obligation underneath those people to actually put things in place, and then of course measuring it as well, so that we can see the positive impact that it has.
Where we started seeing a big change is when reasonable size organizations, so I'm not even going to say a large size, started having a D&I, like a disability, diversity and inclusion officer. Now, if you started kind of seeing those roles for mental health started to spring up within organizations, I see that as a lot of people are having mental health first aiders. This has become something that's quite common now, but that's potentially still falling into, you know, did this person just get involved when there's a problem? But if we had somebody within organizations that maybe one person could stretch and work across three, that implemented good practices that kept people's mental health in a positive territory through preventative, whether that's fitness programs, whether that's other things, be a big change there. And I would personally love to see, you know, mental health officers within organizations that are there to create positive mental health, not just fix issues when it slips into a potential issue for people.
I mean, I actually believe that all managers should it should become compulsory that they should all go on some sort of mental health first aid course. You know, we need to be able to better identify when there is an issue, because my own experience with burnout, which was the unexpected effect of it, was that I found it very, very difficult to talk to anybody about it. One, I didn't have the energy. Secondly, I just felt ridiculous talking about what I was suffering from. And then of course, it just escalates. And then having solutions as well, you know, being able to engage with people, find out what those issues are, and then support them to signpost and or roadmap them towards the right sort of services that can put them on the track to recovery.
And I think it's a very, very important point, you know, and particularly within the burnout that you experienced, if there was somebody that you had been dealing with for the last 4 or 5 years that just was aware of you when you weren't experiencing burnout, because sometimes you're the last person to realize.
Everybody said they just didn't see it coming, and
that's the thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think most people get to a point where they feel like they're burnout to a certain extent, and I've kind of always been very good at regulating emotions. I think I'd like to say I think, because I don't want to tempt fate, but particularly from the athletics point of view, I realized the very close link between mental health and physical health and how great you felt. So when lockdown hit, that probably lured me into a false sense of security that, you know, most things I kind of get through okay, you know, and I don't seem to. But when the gym's not there, the sauna, I love a sauna. I think that's very positive for mental health. That's not there. And then, as you said, all of a sudden, I didn't realize that all of my job as a CEO really involves somebody else. There's very little I do for myself. It's always, so normally I just walk in and grab somebody for 5 minutes and have a great chat and talk about it, but it's a Zoom meeting and everything becomes harder and harder and harder. And my method has always been to try and take care of people. Well, what happens when everybody around you is having problems, which I think a lot of people were, you tend to be the person they turn to, and then all of a sudden I found myself to the point where, you know, I was like, I've got to be very careful here. I'm kind of reaching an edge. But we haven't got this with our organization, and I hope we're introduced, but if there was somebody within the organization that even I could turn to and go, you know, I'm having trouble sleeping at the minute and I don't know what it is. Something as simple as that, to go, right, okay, so What have you been doing the last day? And then when you find kind of offload everything that's been on your shoulders.
Things like the staff handbook, right? Why can't the staff handbook evolve into having, sections that relate to all of this stuff and providing access to the right sort of resources? It's just quite a simple thing, isn't it, really? Small businesses, it's really difficult. A lot of small businesses, and you've got to remember that 90% of businesses are SMEs, or more than 90% of businesses are SMEs in the UK, and many businesses employ less than 10 people, and they don't feel, or certainly from the organisations and the business owners I speak to, they find it very, very difficult to sort of justify putting together some sort of wellness mental health program. So I think that's going to be another evolution, is that the programs that are out there need to evolve to support the small businesses, so they're pre-packaged. I listened to the case study that John Lewis, the guys at John Lewis did. Wow, what a program they've got there. That's just amazing. But then I just thought, there's no way small businesses could even compete even with a fraction of that. But if centralised wellness programs were put together that we could pay into at sensible rates, I think that might be part of the solution to cover the majority of smaller businesses.
Such really, really valid points. And I was going to just jump on what Ross was mentioning around the leadership aspect, because a lot of what we talk about is that compassionate leadership, because to a certain extent, when we're talking about building inclusive cultures, also it's about belonging. And last time we were having a panel and we were discussing about, authenticity at work, because now everybody, and I'm not sure if it's since the whole Black Lives Matter movement, where everybody's now super conscious of, diversity and intersectionality, so to speak, where people are actually starting to see that even when we're talking about mental health, different groups are affected differently. And so one of the employees was saying that what they would like to see is a culture of making mistakes, because it's quite important to actually, first of all, recognize what we did wrong, but essentially kind of communicate through the process as to the changes that we're making, when we're not really deciding on people's heads what we think is right. And you touch on that, Mark, as well, as having those conversations with people. And I think, to your point, Ross, around really connecting with individuals, it takes a bit of gut to kind of go there and really get close to your people. Because I think naturally people fear some level of backlash, judgment, criticism, and that level of resilience is really required as a leader in any way, shape, or form, because in the post-COVID world, and what we talk about in our work is trauma-informed leadership, which is just the sense that as leaders, we need to build a level of awareness and almost like a container for psychological and emotional resilience, and just that awareness that people have stuff going on, below the surface. And that people also need to just invest more time, because the more we connect with others, the more we learn about ourselves as well. And that, I think, bridge is going to be super important, because we don't know what baggage people are going to be bringing. There's a heap of grief that's kind of being silenced right now. But when are we going to have these conversations as well? Because they have their place at work. Now we're pushing the boundaries and talking more and more about inclusion. We need to talk about real lives and what has happened to individuals and how we can better support them compassionately in order to move forward as well.
There's a really important point in there, and that is that there's two elements to mental health, I think. One is those things that we can control ourselves, and that it's easier to support as a business. But those embedded traumas, childhood traumas and things like that, are probably beyond the realms of an internal mental health first aider. But I think we can still sort of identify when there are problems and encourage people to seek the professional help that they need. I know, Maylis, that you guys work in that LGBT space, and there's a lot of real suppressed trauma with individuals who've withheld their sexuality for long periods of time, and how that plays out in later life. And I could imagine those very, very similar traumatic experiences taking place with other elements of trauma that are being sort of withheld within people. So I think it's important that we differentiate between the two things, but we also appreciate that is quite common. It's much more common than we think. And you can probably expand upon that, Maylis, with some of the work that you guys have been doing.
No. I completely agree. I was just kind of like nodding because, it often takes a bit of time when you're meeting with businesses. And specifically, I think where we do a lot more of our work is working within like the employee resource groups, because I think they're also taking ownership of their own kind of intersectional identities, whether it's women, LGBTQ plus people, disability, looking at various areas where they feel like people should be more empowered and have support. And we tend to kind of move around that. And completely, as you said, Mark, it's about differentiating what really belongs to the present and what happens in the past. And I learned from an incredible therapist called Gary Bloom, and he's one of the only sports psychologists and sports therapists. And he just goes to the football teams and rugby teams like once a week and just checks in and just has these spaces where people can explore, go a bit deeper, where they're not always necessarily, in groups. They can have one-to-ones, because I believe that when you want to go below the surface, it can feel quite uncomfortable to get vulnerable in front of your team, your colleagues. And so it's about understanding that if, as you said, Ross, Mark, that the business can't necessarily support that within, their well-being team or, the diversity and inclusion or wherever that finds, they kind of spot or place that. It's about getting those external resources and looking at more of a continuum journey as to where the individual is when they're asking for help and sourcing out help. Like, it's important to always know when we don't know. There was this old alcoholic friend of mine who says, you only know what you know, and you get what you get when you get it. And it always sounded crazy to me, which is like, what are you trying to say? But he simply says that you can't blame yourself for what you don't know. And the best thing you can actually do is just to raise a hand and say, hey, I don't know what I'm doing here, and go to the people who have the resources and tools to support you.
Absolutely. I see so many synergies here between, accessibility, diversity, almost like the same system, but the subject's different, with integrating accessibility and diversity in organizations compared to mental health support. It's phenomenal. What advice would you give to someone who's struggling with the mental health issues?
Yeah, I think for my part, just professionally, I tend to refrain to give advice because it's not my place. You can only suggest. And the interesting thing is, yes, ask for help. Look at your support network. Is there any support at all? Are there people you can really reach out to? And I think essentially, there's so much information as well, I think, that's available online. But again, just being mindful that you're not going to solve every problem by, trusting the Google doctor. And primarily, I think what we've seen has been an essential key in transforming people's lives, or even just on the basic level, allowing for that vulnerability to happen, is just storytelling. There's so much content, I think, that's been produced over the last year or so of how people have managed specific situations, and whether it's podcasts like these or even just other resources, blogs, social media has been incredible, I think, for people just breaking that veil of everything's perfect, we're managing very well through lockdown, and just going a bit beneath the surface. I think it's an opportunity to get curious when you notice that something doesn't feel quite right. The tendency is to focus on what's wrong with me. But if we think about what's already right about us, the fact that you're alive, you're breathing, and your breath can be a powerful tool to really move things in your body. What can you do now for yourself? How can you support yourself? And I think essentially that reach out, we can't advocate and push that enough.
When I say go and get professional help, it doesn't always mean go to your GP, because there is a de facto result of that course of action, which tends to be time off work and putting you on a course of medication, which is often proves to be a jump too far. I think that people, just basing on what you just said, Maylis, is thinking about the components that make up your mental health. We talked about them all. Am I getting enough exercise? Am I eating well? Am I sleeping well? Thinking about the patterns of behaviors that happen before I go to bed that might be affecting my poor sleep. Getting help for any specific medical conditions and stuff, and addressing things one at a time, and trying to take control of these little elements is probably the middle ground. And then you can seek help against those particular individual components as well. I think the problem with going to the GP is that you just tend to get straight onto antidepressants, and they just book you off for blocks of time, 2 weeks straight away, then followed by another 2 weeks if you're still not well enough. And I think that also has a high probability of escalating from a mental health perspective. You're isolating yourself at home. And if you're not combining that time away from the business with other positive elements which are going to deal with the underlying issues, then all you're doing is just kicking a can down the road to a certain degree.
I think you both said absolutely fantastic things. It's almost, when you're in that place, realize what is going right with your life, but also, break the components down of things that you can improve that help your mental state, whether that's exercise, whether that's, you know, being around people, whether that's sharing. The only thing I would add to that is just realize that at some point everybody in the world has needed help, you know. And if people feel like that first, it's like, oh, because people see it as a stigma, some people see it as a failure when the mental health drops. But if they just realize that every person at some point has needed help, it might make them just reach out quicker, and they might, you know, they might be able to kind of reverse that dip a little bit quicker through some of the methods you guys have already mentioned.
When we don't address mental health issues with those people that are closest to us, the outcomes can be catastrophic. You know, I have two people that were, one associated with work and one was a personal friend, who ended up taking their own lives. And that can be the ultimate outcome if we don't listen and look out for the signs and we don't help each other. And we should remember that, you know, because when it happens, it's too late, and you can just only ask yourselves the questions of what could I have done more. So I think we've all got a responsibility to support the people around us, as good human beings. And in the workplace, you know, we're all part of a machine, we're all part of that team, and, you know, helping everybody to be at their best, you know, is a trait that we should all try and embrace, I think.
Completely. And I think just based on what you do as well, Ross, it's quite interesting, because even as service providers and, you know, potentially as business owners as well, like, understanding accessibility needs is so important, because, you know, even us, we know how we've created these contents and workshops to help, you know, the wider LGBTQ plus community throughout lockdown, but with self-improvement tools. But you still have to think inclusively, like you still have to understand what people need. Is the content being received? Like where are, you know, the areas where individuals are not able to, you know, get the best of what you're offering, and having these conversations as well. Because most of us, I think, tend to think that, well, if it's good enough for me, it might be good enough for the next person. But there's just so many nuances in that. And I think for even us as a business, we're constantly still learning, and we're not afraid to get feedback from our participants who are saying, hey, do this better. And then we have to go back and say, yeah, did we listen? Are we doing better? And just have that open consultancy approach where you're just constantly striving to make the best, to do your best, and make mistakes and be honest about it as well.
I think mistakes are fine as long as you continually try and improve. I mean, one of the things we realize, you know, the accessibility of help makes a massive difference to people's mental state. But we realized at the start of lockdown, you know, the accessibility of the information on COVID information is going to be very important here. And a lot of people aren't taking accessibility seriously. And then, so we created a system where anybody who's displaying COVID information can get our software free to use it. But it did actually kind of come true. The worrying prediction I had, and it was, I think there was an outbreak in Birmingham, and that was, a lot of it was due to a lot of people didn't speak English as a first language, and a lot of the materials that were being spread around within the organization, the people couldn't read, so they didn't know kind of how to social distance and the likes of that. And unfortunately, there was a bit of an outbreak. So it does highlight the need. You know, we can put all these things in place, but we've got to make sure that our staff, our friends, our colleagues have access to them in every manner possible. What do we hope for the future of mental health services? I'm going to kick off there, actually. I'm going to say, and this goes with health services in general, I hope mental health services start switching to an organization, whether it's embedded in companies, whether that's embedded in the NHS, that it's better funded, more seriously taken more seriously by the government, but it gets involved in prevention. You know, there's a lot of things that can be prevented through good mental health practices. You know, instead of them getting involved when something goes wrong, you know, whether that's helping people monitor their exercise, their diet, you know, if they just see the first inkling of not feeling so good, they can go and see somebody immediately. And this is not that you're in a bad place, it's just, let's make sure that we keep you in a good place. So I think the big switch, I hope, for mental health services is prevention.
I would like to see business owners take the responsibility and understand the benefits of putting this into play. And I would like to see the services that are required as part of supporting mental health and wellness in the workplace just become so much more accessible. And I think it will happen. I think most businesses want to succeed, and if they understand that there is an underlying commercial benefit to doing this, even if they are heartless individuals, there will be an incentive for them to put that in place. And I do have an underlying feeling that this is starting to happen.
Yeah.
The smarter businesses realise, if they want to attract and retain the best talent that's out there, that there just needs to be a change in mindset. Having a snooker table and a beer fridge isn't enough anymore. I'd like to see that happen quickly over the next 2 or 3 years.
No, I completely agree with you both. And I think from my part, and maybe going specifically to the work that we do, it's just emphasizing that focus on marginalized communities, and just, again, building spaces where people feel included, because in our kind of area, the workplaces can be challenging enough for anyone with mental health. But, if you think about just having, struggling with your own identity, your sexuality, your gender expression, and all of that, it can be just, again, repeating and re-traumatizing for individuals. And in the context of COVID, a lot of the people we've spoken to, somehow going back home and even maybe going back to their families, it felt like they relived that isolation again. And so it's about getting the information and getting a bit, closer to the problem. And I think last time I was seeing an interesting report that came out. It was either during Lesbian Visibility Week, around women who identify, or individuals who identify as female, whether they be trans or non-binary, and the treatment they were receiving and the feedback they were giving when they were being treated, at the hospital or with therapists, and the level of just ignorance, that's kind of present. So there's a lot of work in educating practitioners themselves, even educating all of us as to those kind of nuances. And in my case, I know that when I entered the healthcare space, the first thing I noticed was that there weren't many people who looked like me. And so I was already benefiting from a level of privilege because I had a lot given to me. I had an education, I had access to certain things. So I would never felt challenged to speak up. But when I saw that there weren't many people, of color in those spaces, and that when we were trying to have conversations around trauma, and you talk about, racial trauma or even transgenerational trauma, you had therapists saying to you, well, are you sure that's a thing? Those kind of, I think, encounters can really challenge you and question whether you're crazy or whether you're making something up. But it doesn't take away from the fact that your experience and your lived experience matters. And no matter, what happens, even if you don't have the information, it's still important to get curious about that. And as we said, not be afraid to make mistakes, because that's what part of the culture and the communities that, we want to build. We want to feel stronger together. We don't want to isolate other individuals. And I think from my part, that's really what I'd like to push on.
We've done internally here, which has definitely had a positive impact, is we've empowered the staff to build their own wellness program.
Really?
And
Wow.
And then allowed the individuals within the team to volunteer, to be involved in different aspects of that. Whether it's putting together team building exercises, working on social nights out, thinking about how we spend the budget on the wellness aspects within the business. And that made it a lot easier for me as a business owner as well. And it made the components of what we put into place much more meaningful. So just as an idea, something that's worked very well for us, if a small business is wondering how they're going to go about this and what they should do and what they should prioritize, come up with a budget, find the people that are willing to volunteer to lead on it, and then get collective contributions to the way it goes forward. And then it actually becomes something that's probably much more meaningful to that group of people. One of our projects that we're looking at the moment is, and it may well be over a period of time, but I'm trying to pull together a group of institutions at the moment, supported by two major charities. So the Prince's Trust and the Shaw Trust. So the Prince's Trust is focused very much on closing the gap between education and employment. So we're looking at long-term unemployment, not only as a social issue, but also as a sort of one of the things that obviously influences people's mental well-being as well. And with the Shore Trust, looking at how we can make sort of minority groups, specifically people with disabilities, etc., make jobs more accessible. And one of the things we're looking at doing is partnering with the LEPs to create a free-to-use regional job board, and then get some funding from the government to build something which is much more driven towards addressing these key issues, diversity and inclusion issues, and addressing, some of these really fundamental social issues which exist around employment. And if we can successfully pull it together, the way that I want this all to work is to make this job board accessible through universities, colleges, schools, local councils, because none of them actually currently have a job board. And if you think about the things that prevent, certainly from an employment perspective, businesses offering employment to these minority groups, is the cost of doing it and knowing where to go and do it. From an out of education perspective, you've got leading job boards like Milk Round, which charge £900 for a single advert. Well, what business in their right mind would spend £900 on advertising a job to people with no experience when they can spend £200 on a job board like Total Jobs and get out to 10 times more people with experience? So the prevention and the barrier that exists here is the cost. So one of the things that we've been looking at is how can we build a business model that can utilise a free-to-use job board that we can benefit from commercially, but at the same time deliver on this level of addressing these key issues. So it's going to be interesting to see whether or not we can pull it off. But certainly we would be looking to include the Recycle product as part of that project.
It's a basic human need to feel part of something, and when you have accessibility needs, whether that's your background, your culture, your education, whether you've got a disability, you automatically feel like not included. And that fundamentally has an effect on your mental state. So the more things we can put in place to make people feel included in society, and disabilities, accessibility issues not be a barrier, it would be a very, very important jump. And I'd love to work and help out in any way we could, because I think for me,
sounds awesome.
It's important for society to do that.
Most businesses now, have a DE&I objective. They want to sort of, correct the balance, the imbalance that exists. And I think that we've got to find a way of taking advantage of that while that topic is hot right now, and create some momentum with it. So I think as a project, I'm hoping that we can succeed with it.
No, it's awesome, Mark, because what you really emphasize on is about taking action. And I think previously what we've seen in the D&I space is pledges and other things that are really, they're important to communicate, but internally, really, what is the change that's happening? And I think if resources and collaborations are happening across, public sector, private, just getting that intelligence together is what we need, because essentially I don't believe that there's ever competition in any market, because we all have our unique selling point, and it's about really bringing those insights together and informing new strategies and new opportunities for businesses to get better and support the staff better. So I think that's a really awesome initiative.
Yeah, I think it's great.
Addressing, sometimes it can be a bit of a tick boxing exercise for a lot of businesses as well. So I think building something that actually fundamentally works. First of all, the jobs are made accessible to the target audience. The target audience is able to access the jobs. And then within the functionality, the technology aspect of it, we measure it so that there is accountability and visibility of what's actually going on. And that makes it much more difficult for it just to say, yeah, we're diverse in the way that we open up our jobs to anybody. I think bringing these things together and just making it more accessible, can have a positive effect.
We launched Recite 10 years ago, and it's good to see the concept now is that common. We've got competitors all around the world that is based on our idea. So it is kind of good to see, and sometimes not when they beat us with contracts. But that was like, oh, we've got our first sale, we'll get going, and it took 5-6 years later for the concept really to pick up. So it's great. It's nice to be able to do something that, when you've done your job well, it affects somebody else in a positive way. I think that's always fantastic. So thank you very much for that, guys. Thank you to Mark. Thank you for Maylis for joining us in this Mental Health Awareness Week. I've been Ross Linnett, and this has been the All Inclusive Podcast.